Thank you. Good morning. It's a great honor to be here to participate in this most important symposium and to honor the legacy of the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi. I'm especially honored this morning to be the moderator of this high-level panel. The participants need no introduction, but nevertheless I've been asked to do so, so I will. Excellencies, first let me introduce His Excellency President Paul Kagame, the President of the Republic of Rwanda, who has been, of course, President since 2000. Before that was the Vice President and Minister of Defense from 1994 to 2000, and of course, the general who liberated, the freedom fighter who liberated Rwanda from the tyranny of genocide. I'd also like to introduce His Excellency Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn, who has been the Prime Minister, of course, since 2012, and prior to that was Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of the Federal Republic of Ethiopia. He's a civil engineer as well as an academic, and so thank you, sir, for being here. Good morning. I'd also like to welcome and introduce His Excellency Vice President Kwesi Amisa Arthur, who was sworn in August of 2012 as the Vice President of Ghana. He is former governor of the Bank of Ghana, an economist, an academic, and a politician. Welcome. So this morning we are to engage in rigorous intellectual deliberation and in-depth analysis of issues related to development with respect for the tradition and the legacy of our brother, the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi. I think that we can have a very hard-hitting discussion. Of course, His Excellency President Kagame has already started us on that path with his opening address, as well as Madam Azeb Mesfin, who again also gave us a context for the Prime Minister's ideas about the democratic developmental state. So this morning I'd like to ask questions related to how you actually practice democratic developmental, how do you build a democratic developmental state? What is your experiences? And I'll ask each one of you, what has been the experience of your government, especially given the diverse economies represented this morning, and what do you feel is really the concept of a developmental state? And how does that relate to democratization in terms of popular participation, multi-party competition, and civil society engagement? We'll start with you, Excellency President Kagame.
Thank you, Dr. Jenda, and dear friends and colleagues on this panel. I wish to start by first just dissecting a little bit what we are talking about. We are talking about the state, we are talking about development, we are talking about democracy being in between, and then other things. So in our case here, building on those elements was very essential. And in fact, the other element that is very important is people that are always forgotten. We talk about leaders, we talk about all kinds of things, and sometimes the people are left out of the discussion. At the moment one looks at it this way, that it's the leaders, it's the structures of the state, it's the service to the people, it's how during the exercise of governance people play their role and make choices, and in making these choices and playing their role, in fact, we realize these different kinds of thinking and entities so to speak, you realize that the multi-party situation develops because people are trying to think differently and they group around political thinking that is normally identified or associated with any of these political parties. So it's an exercise of, can we have a debate, express our different opinions, and make choices, but at the same time, be mindful of the very fact that we are actually working towards a common interest, which in the end is to serve the whole nation, even with all this kind of diversity that may exist within any single nation state. So this is what has been at the back of our minds whenever we have carried out our responsibilities, and we have seen from one point to another that there is progress made on that basis.
Thank you. Prime Minister Haile Mariam, please.
First of all, I would like to thank you, Jandai, for moderating this very important symposium. I would like to say that my comments and remarks are based on, the great leader, Meles Zenawi, as his disciple and the cadre, which has been trained, educated by him. So I cannot detach when I want to talk about democratic developmentalism in Africa, that we need to understand the conceptual underpinnings on how this democratic developmental state is going to be created. First of all, I think Meles agrees with all the proponents of those who researched scholarly and who has also practiced the developmental state in their own respective countries, like in East Asia. But one distinct issue which I just want to highlight to this symposium today is a unique contribution that Meles has made to the global community, is that even the proponents of developmental state concept has some hesitations as regards to whether it is possible to construct a developmental state to be a democratic developmental state or not. Some of them who support the developmental state concept, even they do not agree, where Meles strongly disputed that it is possible to have a democratic developmental state in Africa. Even he goes to the extent that those countries in East Asia who has pursued to bring about transformative change in their countries to extricate their people out of abject poverty has gone in a long distance, and they could have even democratized their own country earlier than it happened. Because he argues that there has been social capital and basis that democratization can take place even in those countries. As a man who fought for his entire life to bring about changes in Africa, to bring the people out of poverty trap, extreme poverty, which is devastating, his thinkings, his search for a better way how Africa can get out of this quagmire has been the basis for his research and intellectual works. And we have been taught on this, as a policy as well as conceptual, ideological, and political clarity upon his guidance. And we came to know that the three characteristics of, conceptually of developmental state, like, every developmental state has to be obsessive to bring about a radical transformative change to the people who are in destitute poverty, and should see that, the political leaders should see that this is an existential issue that has to be taken care, with a strong motive and, works. In this regard, I think Meles has defined clearly that development is, not only development for se, but accelerated development, which is broad-based, inclusive, and shared by the people, is imperative. And the second issue is that, the nature and characteristics of these states resides on the fact that, this idea, this project of developmentalism has to be shared by the, majority of the society, sections of society of that specific country. Otherwise, it's not implementable because there is no social capital earlier which has been built. And you have to build in due course the social capital necessary. And it should be shared, and it should be an ideal. And the third issue, and the most important issue, where even those who fight against the Meles idea, the orthodoxy which Madame Azeva as well as President Kagame has mentioned, the neoliberal, orthodoxy which has been practiced. It is a religion, a phase that, development workers and development agents and international institutions try to baptize Africans without even testing them whether they are can be correctly implemented or not. And that has brought a disastrous result in Africa. And not only in Africa, but the liberalization and post-Soviet Union in the countries of the Soviet bloc has also brought, miserable result. That was the time when Meles has come from armed struggle to, becoming the leader of a great nation, Ethiopia. So he has to think about a state, an effective state that can extricate these people out of poverty. I think if that's the case, then the third characteristics, which even the neoliberals has, always saying that African states are predatory states, which are, so much indulged into corrupt practices, and therefore there is no, basis for democratization or development to take place. Therefore, this state has to be minimized, which, as the president said. But the issue is that any developmental state, the characteristics of those which you cannot ignore because it is a nagging reality of the Southeast Asian practice, that the state has to be in arm's length from the business community, the private sector. That it shouldn't be getting into the pockets of the business community. If that's the case, then there is no possibility for the state to act supporting those developmentalist private sector and business, and also correct and tame those who are indulging themselves into wasteful rent-seeking and network of patronage. So I think in this way we have understood and clearly understood that there should be a policy space for the developmental state, not only from the private sector, but the addition is Meles has also added that this policy space has to be also from the international aid organizations who try to give policy rent so that you change your own policy in domestic situation, which has been designed in domestic situation. So I think these are the issues that the concept of developmental state has pressed in. But Meles' unique addition is that these developmental states can both be undemocratic as well as democratic. This is it. So now, well, how can it be democratic? The issue is there are the proponents of even developmental states, they argue that there is no institutional capability in poor countries like in Africa. And how can you build democracy while there is weak social capital? And they say that for some time, it's better that states should be authoritarian. And some, like Gordon White, even go to the extent that, like the East Asian, the states should be rationally authoritarian, if not embedded authoritarian. But Meles argues that it is possible to make a state to be democratic. His argument, I believe, emanates from his experience in armed struggle, where he worked with the peasants, rural communities, that it is possible to make a broader coalition with this rural community so that you will have a basis to be elected time and again in the democratic process. And also basing on agriculture, it is also possible to get support while bringing transformation in rural areas. And similarly, in urban areas, you can also go for gradually increase the support base from low income, and as well as to some extent from the middle class and the working class as well. But the whole thing is that, you know, there is no inherent incompatibility between democracy and development. That's his idea. He has gone to the extent studying some democracies in Asia, like Malaysia, where development, accelerated development, along with democratization has gone in tandem. Similarly, he has also studied in Africa, countries like Botswana, and to some extent Mauritius, who has witnessed rapid, accelerated development as well as democratization. So his conclusion was, therefore, it is possible in Africa to bring about democratic developmentalism as a main issue. And I think he has gone, some proponents also argue that if there is pluralism and democratic activism, then there will be democratic competition and there will not be a policy continuity when parties change time and again. That was one argument. Of course, Meles does not ignore this argument, but he says that there are dominant party democracies in the globe, including that of Japan, he argues, that stayed for half a century in power, and that of Sweden with the best democracy globally, but stayed for decades as a dominant party. So in Africa, it's also possible to have a dominant party system where democracy can be exercised, in a full. So I think this is the main contribution that Meles has given to the globe and to the Africans, his gift that has to be applauded. And therefore, I would like to say there is a conceptual clarity now after Meles' work that Africa can have developmental states that are also democratic.
Thank you very much for that. Vice President Amisa, author, Ghana, is it a developmental state? Clearly, many would say it's a democratic state. What is Ghana's path for development?
Thank you. Well, I think our practice has defined what we have achieved. For me, the developmental state is defined by creating political space to generate economic development that seeks the long-term interests of people. So we need to create autonomy for the government, for the leaders, to be able to pursue the long-term interests of the people, economic development, poverty reduction, without the special interests, without international donor interests that at one stage praise a government that has created conditions that reduce poverty, that improve maternal health, that has low corruption, but at the same time require the government to be more democratic. Now, so then it creates a condition where governments can pursue those long-term interests if then it becomes authoritarian. Because our experience with democracy suggests that the creation of political parties, the financing of political parties, create special interests that then can ambush that whole developmental state. And we can discuss this at length, but just to generalize, Ghana is now defined more as a democratic state than as a developmental state. Maybe 10, 15 years ago, it would have been the other way around. So we have a situation where we created conditions through the developmental state for a democracy to develop that has almost derailed the central focus of economic policy making that sought the long-term interests of people by engaging the social partners in governance and also by engaging the donor community, as President Kagame says, the NGOs and the other donors in that way. So just to summarize, we see the role of the politician as creating space to pursue long-term interests of our people. And maybe the political scientists in 20 years' time will determine whether we succeeded or not. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's push the concept a little more. I think it's extremely helpful to talk about the unique contribution that Prime Minister Malice created to the developmental state, which comes in some ways, there's a motto from East Asia to say that it must be democratic because of the diversity of this continent. But how can a state address and tackle the social exclusion and marginalization of particular communities? And is there a danger that the state, in its intervention for fast economic growth, could reinforce patterns of regional differences, poverty, and marginalization? And I ask you especially, Prime Minister Haile Mariam, because you're from the southern parts of Ethiopia. You were the leader of a political party that represented the southern peoples. And so can you really, President Kagame talked about how it's an organic process of the developmental state addressing the population, the grassroots population, but you sounded more like it's a mobilization of that population. Is there a threat of reinforcing patterns of regional differences?
Jandai, thank you so much. I think democratic developmentalism also needs institutional setups that can cater for these diversities and regional differences. If you see our system, we have intentionally made Ethiopian as a federal democratic republic, where the decentralization and devolution of power to the grassroots has been actually been materialized. So we are in a federal system, and even within the federation, if you see my state, where I came from, we have more than 56 ethnic groups in that state, in contrary to the bigger state like Oromia, which is only one ethnic group. But we have federation within federation, where we can cater the issues that can be raised by every group in the country. But the most important thing is that there is public mobilization, where the state is functioning in such a way that even not as a remote supporters like in the East Asia, but ownership of the policy and programs and projects by the people and implemented through the people. so that it will be effective and yields result. So I think that has helped us. We call it a developmental army, where the government and institutions of the government and the public, in organized manner, they come together, discuss about the policies, agree on them, and design and plan together and implement them, evaluate together, monitor it, and finally go through this cycle of development management. So I think in our case, it is much more decentralized, handling the issues, aspirations, and needs of all the interest groups, even though you cannot bring about all of them, but the majority of it. So I think there is so much complaint by the marginalized groups, because that has been taken care by the institutional setup mechanisms. We have intentionally also, designed a parliamentary system where, people be, represented. But contrary to the neoliberal prescription, where, procedural democracy is seen at the outset, we say it should be a participatory democracy beyond election that goes engaging all the sections of society. For us, the women group are the most active group in this process. And recently also the youth, in organized manner, they are discharging their responsibility and ownership in the program and projects. So I think this inclusive process has helped us a lot in maintaining, for the last 12 years, a double-digit growth in the country, and which is shared and inclusive. If you see the Gini coefficient of Ethiopia, it is comparable to the best ones, like the Sweden and other Scandinavian countries, which is around 0.3. So this is the best model which we implemented.
President Kagame, how has Rwanda addressed centrally led priority setting and resource allocation with creating space for local decision making? How have you designed your political system and your governmental policies to achieve this?
You see, the most important aspect of this debate and discussion is that we are also talking about democracy or development and markets. Still more complicated, a combination of all of them. I think the discussion is about, we may have a situation where we have to debate, does one size, one definition fit all? So this is now where we are. And it puts a spotlight on the definition of democracy. Because the way the process works, and dependent on the structures and setup in different places, things are completely different. And if you want to use one definition or one size fitting all scenario, then things don't work, in my opinion. But the Vice President of Ghana mentioned something I want to build on. Really here it's about creating that space. Creating space means there is room for the people, irrespective of their backgrounds, thinking about the common good that I earlier mentioned, being able to express their interests, their grievances, and therefore also through that contributing to that common good. That is what space is about. It's also space for leaders under any one given structure within the state to actually rationalize and think about these different interests of the people on the ground, and also their grievances and how do they get addressed within these structures that are supposed to serve everyone. So open space, providing space is very important. Very often the problem we have is the kind of definitions we give either to democracy or this space. It is as if the definition comes from whoever is providing that definition. Somebody provides the definition thinking about their own interests, not the interests where the kind of definition is being exercised. So in Rwanda, we have stressed a number of things. One has been to understand our specific problem as it is, but also putting it in a much wider context by looking at other problems and how they have affected people in those different situations. But taking responsibility and ownership for our problems and for our solutions. The next step is to say, how does every Rwandan contribute? How do they become part of any process to improve their lives within this provision of space where the people and the leaders, the state, have to exercise their responsibilities? This is where our main focus has been, and of course, drawing lessons from many things that have been working in other places or studies that have been made by people that are really evidence-based. When we are talking about the study made on this particular situation of development and the state and democracy, how they interact, there is evidence there in the study. As we take ownership and responsibility for our own situation, we draw lessons from all this study and evidence that has come from that. So for us, really, it is, and you see, we have also been educated by our own context. In fact, we have come from a situation not so long ago where there was no state. So we had to create the state. The tragic situation of 20 years ago destroyed even the state as it were, with all its weaknesses and failures. That was destroyed. So we had to build anew from different realities altogether. So we had to create not only the state and therefore the processes through which it should work. We had to put in place also these other processes that allow democracy or democratization to happen in the context of Rwanda, and also to allow development of the citizens of this country. So what was created took the lead in that, but should not do everything that needs to be done. And as the Prime Minister said also, once the state structures are exercising their responsibility, they have to bear in mind where do they stop and where do other things? At what point do they take over to do what they need to do? For example, if you are talking about the private sector, now the private sector has its own role to play, but within what prevailing circumstance, and therefore which other structures are there to support what the private sector does, and how do the citizens of this country participate and take advantage of what is provided between these responsibilities of the state and also the markets as they exist. So in our case, it is from a very complicated situation, actually, of where the situation is that the state didn't exist, almost nothing else existed because, even because of that. So everything has been building from the bottom up. But the state has that after putting the state in place and making it work the way it should, having survived the failure of the state or non-existence of the state, and making sure that the framework is clear and has been created for players to play, and each one being mindful of their limits and how they interact with the other for the completion of the task we have for our own country.
Is there, President Kagame, is there a transition point? Does a developmental state, obviously after the genocide in Rwanda, frankly in Ethiopia after the civil war and the Derg was pushed out, the state has to take, you have to reconstruct the state, and the state has to take an interventionist role to restructure society, to build an economy. But is there a point at which the developmental state falls away? Or is it forever?
Well, I would say yes and no. In a sense that there is that point when the developmental state isn't playing the very active role it was playing yesterday, meaning there is that loosening of the grip in terms of the developmental state, because what the Prime Minister called the social capital continues to develop and evolve and take over some of these responsibilities. But it would be wrong to give it a timeline and think that there is a specific date and time when this must happen. It's something that continues to evolve and develop over time, as we have seen even in other places, including actually the developed countries that pride in decades and centuries of democracy. There is still that role of the state. Only that over time they have also learned to disguise that. Yes. And operate through different invisible, structures and hands and so. But they are the ones that are pulling the strings. So they are present, but only they are present only in a different form. So I don't think we should be learning to exercise this deception ourselves. I think we should be real. We should be. So really, there is, there is growth of capacity and involvement of one and reduction of the other. But this must happen and play out in as far as we are mindful of the health of society in which this is happening. Yes.
Thank you.
Jandai, I think I fully concur with the president. But the experience shows that, Meles used to argue that market failure still exists in a very aggressive way in developing countries, poor countries in Africa. But that's also true, the experience of the capital markets globally. And the 2007 experience shows that there needs to be market failure, and it exists. And even those industrialized countries who claim to be that market functions in every aspect, but they failed. They started to use public money to bail out those banks. So I think this is a striking reality, that market is not functioning as they used to say, as they used to preach to us that it works. So similarly, the technological progress, there is, as Meles clearly argues, that there is a market failure in technological advancement. Apple is a result of the defense research in the United States. It's not the company Apple who has brought smartphones. Had it not been for the defense research by the government intervention, we couldn't have seen Apple and smartphones now. So I think there are market failures where the government has to intervene, even in industrialized countries. So it is a matter of progress that we make, how to intervene. But of course, as the president says, it loosens through time. There are areas where the market functions properly, where the government is not needed to intervene. But there are additional new areas that are emerging that the government has to intervene in the economy. I think that's...
I think we have to concede that all states intervene in the economy with incentives and regulations,
For sure.
and putting emphasis on different sectors and providing support to those sectors when it sees it in its strategic interest. Vice President, Ghana. Ghana is a country, and you yourself in terms of your role as the central bank governor. I want to pick up on your experience there in terms of getting space and autonomy from international institutions, the international orthodoxy about how economies should grow, as well as you're sitting on the other side of that as a consultant of the World Bank in Gambia. How you've seen it on both sides. What is that? What is the role of Africa's autonomous development, trying to both build economies as well as building democratic societies with the international community's sense of how Africa should progress?
Thank you. I think that the relevant part of my experience is as Deputy Finance Minister for 12 years, more than central bank part. So let me focus on that. It is first the recognition that economic policy is not neutral in terms of the people it affects. In 1983, thereabouts, we started a process of liberalizing our economy. And everybody thought that an exchange rate reform was important. And we went ahead and reformed the exchange rate from very overvalued rate, and we became more market-determined rate. Now, while it improved the incentives to the farming sector, especially cocoa exports, and there was a major improvement in poverty regarding the farm community, which is a majority, it also affected farms, especially in the northern part of our country, which were involved in rice cultivation, because the exchange rate overvaluation supported the inputs that came into those farms. It also, in effect, destroyed fishing communities in the coastal part of our country. So that same policy affected different groups differently. The way we tried to address the concern of the the rice farmers, of the fishing community, was to put together a plan that mitigated the impact of the exchange rate reform. Now, the fear that I think has been expressed in this room is that we need to find a solution to not making that mitigation permanent. That does not make the people who benefit from it feel entitled to it. And so the entitlement then becomes a problem, because then they think that this is natural and it should last forever. And that then constrains the ability of the policymaker to move on. Because in some of the coastal areas that I'm talking about, the impact of global developments also affected them. And therefore, the government then has to make solutions to that. So that's the first part of the question. How does one relate to the international community in its concerns? And I tried to address that in a very summary way at the beginning. What we experienced was, at one stage, were complimented by the donor community for taking tough decisions, for being able to stay the course and doing what was right, what was rational. But quickly, because a middle class had been created, which had benefited from the economic reforms, then they started a process of requesting for a bigger voice in the priority setting. So then democracy then became the issue, quickly adopted by the international community, which just previously had been praising us for economic reforms and the progress, then suddenly said that, well, but it lacks democracy. And that's the problem that I find in all this debate, that it's as if there's development state at one end and democracy at the other, and therefore, if you are developmental, you are not democratic enough. How do we create the conditions that we can have both? Maybe it's a contradiction that you cannot have a program that is all embracing, that supports the largest majority of the people, so long as democracy is not there, so long as we don't defend the special interests of the people who finance the political campaign, of the people who benefit from government interventions. It means you haven't done enough for that. And that's how I see the international community's impact. The democracy is seen as a pure form of arrangement, not as the arrangement, as the context that provides for our people to have a voice in there, that people who do not have a voice suddenly have a voice because they've received education, because the health status has improved, and therefore they are able to participate in national life. We see that, and maybe we'll find that in this room, we'll find the support for African governments to pursue what is important at the same time as the elements of democracy are embedded in the system. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one last round of questions, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience for the interactive session. Africa, in terms of its political development, has seen strong state intervention as a theory and perhaps a practice immediately after independence. And it took the form of one-party states, which felt that they needed to be more efficient, I should say, that they could represent the broader interests of society, and that they would have greater impact quickly on economic development that led to inclusiveness. Arguably, that experience failed. How is what we're talking about today different? And particularly, how do you guard against the developmental state, even with the acknowledgement that it doesn't need to be authoritarian, actually becoming authoritarian? And we talked about economic interests, not one of the aspects of the developmental state is that economic interests don't capture. But what about corruption of the state itself? by state officials. I'll go down the line. President Kagame.
First of all, I think we have to start right from the beginning. The beginning is not when one-party states started existing in terms of, say, after independence. Because what was there actually before independence? So I think one-party states were a product of what existed before them.
Yes.
Really, that
colonial
is
state.
Absolutely, the colonial state.
Yes.
The colonial state was a different one-party state. So there was a continuation of that, and that's where the problem started. And I think now we are seeing change in that. And of course, there is always a danger that in some places there is that continuation until now. But the struggle and the understanding and the aspiration of the Africans is that should change. And in many places of Africa, that has changed. We see competition in politics. We see pluralism existing, and I think we also see what the Prime Minister said earlier, that sometimes people may see this as a problem, but it really necessarily doesn't have to be a problem, because we see that even in other places other than the continent of Africa. When, for example, there was this a political party that dominates politics and stays in power for 3-4 decades. We've seen it outside of Africa. We've seen it in developed countries where there are these dominant political parties. So if it happens there and it happens in Africa, why is it wrong in Africa and right in these other countries? Unless we go further into defining that and really show specifically where the problem lies. Otherwise, so we have this. And we have also situations in Africa where actually there is this change that happens more regularly than in other places, where parties may take over from others, and you have that. So really, we have to avoid this kind of it's dictatorship, but the absence of dictatorship can manifest in very many other forms. It isn't, again, only one situation we have in mind that works and fits everywhere, because we have found that is not the case. So Africa is undergoing a process of struggle to put things right in terms of governance and in different forms, in different places. Again, as I said earlier, maybe it should take us back to really making sure we understand, if at all we understand it the same way, what we mean even by democracy. I think all of us are talking about democracy. Everybody talks about democracy, but are we giving it the same and broad definition it deserves to have? Or we are just making, we are defining it selectively, depending on what we have on our mind and what we think is going to serve us, not us, this time not the people where the question is being asked, but even with the countries that are asking this question about Africa. Because I have seen that even for things where they have been working in Africa, in the same way as they have been working in developed countries, there are still more questions asked about that than asked about the same, because they are the ones asking anyway. Yes, there is no such where you turn to the other one and also start questioning some of the things they are doing. The questioning is just one way. So this is where the problem lies.
Gender.
Just one quick follow-up. How do you define democracy?
No, I want to hear from you first, or from I'll give you my definition, but I think I just want to be sure we are understanding it the same way, because I have seen that the definition is being applied selectively in many ways. This is why I raised that question. But you can come to it maybe when we have engaged the audience.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I think you are true. You are correct that after the colonial era, the African states, monolithic states, has failed. But I want to extend. The president has extended the colonial era as one monolithic state that has given that experience to the African states to emulate the colonial state. But you have to also see, it's not only the African states that have failed, but the neoliberal prescription that has been given to cure these African states has also failed. So that failure has continued, and therefore that's why Meles has said we have to have a new beginning, a new paradigm for Africa. And that's why the democratic developmental state as one best option, effective option, has come as a way forward. I think it is possible, as I mentioned earlier, to democratize a country while developmentalism is taking place.
Thank you very much. Vice President.
Well, I think that we have had one-party state. We had at some point a life president declared by parliament and so on. We've gone through that whole process. We see the whole process as part of the political maturation process, where a system that is imposed through colonial rule then develops through various forms, and it arrives where we are now. My understanding of the process is that when governments feel that their efforts are being dissipated through artificial debate, that doesn't create conditions for progress, however defined in terms of the majority of people who are below poverty level who have to be raised. Then governments, African governments, then have to decide how to marshal the resources that are available to them in order to make progress. So we're talking about a transition that was the one-party state. We have moved on from there. We have come to a situation where African governments are addressing the needs of people defined through all kinds of sophisticated ways now. And we will continue to make progress, because I don't believe that we've arrived at a happy state where everything is nice and comfortable. There will be more challenges along the way, and we'll have to find in our own cultures ways in which we address them. Currently, there are all kinds of issues surrounding the political processes about terms, governments in office, whether there should be term limits or not, and the various issues that have come in. As I say, it's part of the process of political maturity that we are developing. Every country has to decide for itself how that process will conclude. But for us, there's quite a body of knowledge that suggests that a 4-year term may not be long enough for a government to put together an economic program and see results. And that the short term is defining us. And in the short term, governments that don't want to be unpopular will then step back from taking hard-headed decisions that are necessary for the progress of the society. And that is not seen to be good enough. And we need to look at it in our own context, whether the institutional systems have been developed that will allow for those priorities to continue even after a government has left office. Last week, 2 weeks ago, our National Development Planning Commission introduced a 40-year development plan that seeks to mobilize the nation around this idea, rather than every 4 years, any president that comes then develops his own program, and by the time he's been able to pass it through Parliament, his term of office is over, and a new one is not. So that the discontinuity in economic planning is something that we need to deal with. I say that we'll need to do something about that. The second point that I wanted to make is about integration. What I've seen of the countries that have developed this development state is that they have large markets that will able then for autonomous development to take place. We have in West Africa very tiny countries that do not have the capacity within themselves to mobilize resources in order to do things for themselves. And so we are always looking out because we don't have a market that assures that economic agents will be able to manifest themselves in there. So that integration is something that we need to look at. And I know that in East Africa, we've moved along much better than the ECOWAS has done, but there's increased emphasis on getting the ECOWAS countries to continue and pursue this integration model to provide us with this. So that is the story from our end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now it's your turn to participate in developing this new paradigm.
Sorry, Jindai, I'm sorry to hijack
Please.
the session, being a South African and all. I'm so sorry. Ladies and gentlemen, you are aware that today's symposium is happening under the auspices of the Mele Zenawi Foundation, the African Development Bank, and under the stewardship of the government of Rwanda as led by President Kagame. So in this conversation, we've heard a lot about the role of the state and the parameters in which the state should and should not be operating. There is one agency we haven't discussed. Those are development finance institutions and the partners to the state. And I'd like to just take this opportunity to get a brief comment from the president of the African Development Bank who has joined us and find out from you, Dr. Kaberuka, in the creation of a democratic development state, where do the partners come in?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ilaroto. Good morning, leaders. My apologies for coming late. I had challenges getting here. But I'm happy I'm at this symposium. I was privileged to speak at the last symposium, Nadis, courtesy of Azeb and the government of Ethiopia, and I articulated what I thought was the golden opportunity given to all of us by Mele Zenawi in the way he approached these issues. Now, I'm an outgoing president, by the way, forget to say that. So, which means there's a saying in some of the African languages that if you want to fight a crocodile, you wait until you get out of the water. So I'm on the way out of the water, now I can talk about the crocodile. But here's the problem, seriously, for development organizations. For some of you who are young, you may not recall, there was a report in 1980. It was called the Accelerated Development in Africa, issued by the World Bank. I want to urge you to go back to that report because it thoroughly influenced the world as it saw Africa for a very long time. And what it said was to put it schematically, the state was bad, the markets were the solution, in such a fundamentalist way. And so they proceeded to dismantle marketing boards, to weaken the state, remove subsidies, so to turn the state into what Mele Zenawi called a watchman, a night watchman. That's what he said. Unfortunately, the manuscript he has written, which is called Dead Ends, New Beginning, is not published. But basically, he said that was the beginning of the problem. So from one fundamentalist viewpoint, that the state could do everything, to another fundamentalist point, that the state was bad, we spent 20 years in the middle of nowhere. Until we realized that that paradigm was not working for all of us. So what happened? What happened then in development institutions, we were very smart at finding new solutions. So from 1980 to 1990, the paradigm from the World Bank, African Development Bank, the bilaterals was get the state out of the economy, the markets will resolve everything. That was what happened. And we implemented that with missionary zeal. Now, when they realized it was not working, then they invented two new terms. As I said, I'm leaving in 2 weeks, so I don't care what I say here. They invented two new formulas. They said, oh, no. It was not the markets which were wrong. It was the lack of capacity. And then it was the lack of governance. In fact, what they were saying was the state was missing. But it was defined as a lack of capacity, but they didn't say capacity to do what. And then they say governance, but how was it defined? So this is what we have been doing, frankly. Now, when I first discussed this with Mele Zenawi, the way he came to it was very pragmatic, non-doctrinaire. He was saying, what is it that works for us? Now, the financial crisis in 2008 and Albidan Lerato has helped all of us. Because there is saying nowadays that maybe in the last half a century, two things have happened which have helped all of us to think much more clearly. The first one was the collapse of the Berlin Wall, which said communism, liberal democracy, we don't know which is what works. And then the collapse of Lehman Brothers, which put an end to the belief in fundamentalism on the markets. Now we know that if you go in the G20, you have got 20 powerful economies who have come to develop from very many different paths. Some have come to it from neoliberal capitalism, others from state-driven capitalism, others from welfare capitalism, others from what we call muddling through, learning as you go. So, if you are to ask me now that I'm leaving the bank, the issue is this. Frankly, we don't know how development happens. No one does. We know what kills development. If somebody drives down the economy like they are doing, well, Mr. President, can you allow me to be undiplomatic? Yeah. There's a country in the Southern African region which basically ruined the economy by macroeconomic, you drive down the currency, you hyperinflation. That will kill the economy. That we know. So we know what kills the economy. But it is only a very small part of what makes the economy happen. The rest, every country has to find for themselves what is it that works for them. Now, that might mean disagreeing with international development institutions. And by the way, to be honest with you, I think now, as countries have many more options, we're beginning to eat humble pie. I think you are going to find that international organizations will be much more humble, much more willing to listen. But it is up to the countries to put their foot down and say, we are going to figure out what works for us and come and work with us. That is what I would say. But I'm writing a book, wait for it.
Thank you.
Can I vote for you?
For questions from the floor, and I think there are microphones that should be circulating. Just to help Jindai Fraser, please just introduce yourself and pose a question. She's nicer than I am, which is why I'm just kind of usurping her authority right now. You must ask a question, because in that way we can get more conversation going. And just to kick it off, I'll start with a question. I am a journalist, and so that's the hat I'm putting on right now. Prime Minister, we've said a lot about the need to create space for expression so that governments can rationalize policy. The perception is that for you to have a developmental state, the state has to be heavy-handed. And in the case of Ethiopia, that is the perception, is that the government will railroad economic policy no matter the cost to human rights, no matter the cost to dissent. Is that the trade-off?
The right answer is no. Because, we have earlier understood that Ethiopia is a diverse country. And you cannot accommodate the interests, wishes, aspirations, and identity of all Ethiopians in one line, one thinking, and one party. So there should be an accommodation for all interests, and the only means to do so is having a multi-party democratic exercise in the country. And when you see institutions that are very much needed to have a democracy, Jenda asked, what's democracy for you? And for us, democracy is engagement of the people to make decisions on the way, both at the participatory level and at the representative level. And in that sense, I think we need to have a plural society. Both parties, media, organized groups, all have their say in the decision making and bringing the country forward. Have a broad national consensus on basic issues, especially on the constitution. We have the best constitution globally, which recognizes all, the basic human rights principles that are enshrined by United Nations. So I think we are party to it, and we are obliged to observe our constitution. But there are one sensitivity by the journalists that has created this perception. That is, there are some few who involve themselves with groups like, I am sure Rwanda also suffers from this, groups, failed states somewhere where the bandits hide. And some of the bloggers and others work with these groups to destabilize the country. And as state, the government has responsibility to, secure its own people from bombings and terrorism. And when you capture those guys, you journalists, you come out and say, yeah, journalists are arrested and this government is repressive. So I think this is the perception you yourself created on Ethiopia. And we are working on it, and we have to somehow deal to ease this perception that's going on now in some corners. But I think there is understanding, from even the big media outlets like BBC you are in, after coming and seeing how our people are organized and engaging in development process and democratization. So they have come to understand that they have not properly understood the whole chemistry in the country. I think this is where we are.
Thank you. President Kagame.
Yeah. Thank you, Jenda. I just wanted to build on the point Dr. Kaberuka raised. Well, I'm still in the water, but I have to fight the crocodile. So, but what I'm trying to say here is, you see, with those people who are, for example, saying the state is bad, the markets are good, So get rid of the state. I think they should have been asked, do they have states or not? Why do they expect others not to have states, but they have them? So if the state is bad, why is it good for you and bad for me? This is the whole thing. But states can be bad depending on how they are operating, how they function. So that has to be corrected, absolutely. But you just don't say, well, get rid of the state. It really means something else. It means get rid of the state and I will fill the void for you. Yes, they become the state that runs the markets that they are saying are good. So I think from the beginning, this conversation must always raise these questions and push back. And that's what will make the debate healthier. That's what I wanted to say.
No, not at all. Thank you. To the floor, how do we define this paradigm? What questions do you have for the leaders? Who has the microphone? Can someone with the microphone, the questions here? Yes, of course, you have your own microphone.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Excellencies. My name is Mahbub Maalim, the Executive Secretary from IGAD. The late Prime Minister, God rest his soul, argued that it's only on the existence of all knowledge that we have an opportunity to generate new ones. And only on the use of all knowledge do we have an opportunity to operationalize new ones. Now, based on that, and the fact that everything that is being said today are things that, as Africans, we have been grappling with all our lives. We have done our own conflict resolution mechanisms, we have survived disasters, and we've lived as people. What does this mean when you try to juxtapose our way of life to the contemporary democratic principles? And is it the time right now for us to be able to invest and research on what I call alternative democracy? I have a concept that I've been very shy to talk about, but now that I hear leaders are talking about it, I think it's the time for us to really make it a subject of discussion. On the development agenda, Your Excellencies, particularly looked at it from the point of view of multi-state cooperation, what we call regional integration. How do you make these people owned? I'm talking about investment in heavy infrastructure, which our economist friends would like to convince us is the way, against borderland developments on macro issues that then get people to live together and understand each other better. Thank you.
Who would like to take the question? It's a general question. Yes. Excellent.
I think research is always needed for any development because there are new things emerging through the course of development. But we cannot wait until the research comes and get the alternative ways for democracy to take place. I think the current universal democratic principles are good enough for us to use them and make them, a part of our process. And we have also party to this UN Declaration on Democratic and Human Rights Principles. And if we apply those correctly, I think these are good enough. But the way forward, we have to understand better how development and democracy, emerge and go in hand to support each other in the due course. And it's a practice, an ongoing practice that has to be developed. And African researchers has to go on, looking into the depths of these issues in a proper sense. As far as the multi-state state cooperation is concerned, I think African regional blocs are now on the right track on doing this. The thing is how to expedite this process that can bring about larger markets where Africa is not trading with each other, but with Western countries and other Eastern countries. So we need to expedite the intra-Africa trade, which can help us more to integrate together to have a greater share in the markets.
Thank you. President Kagame?
Let me add to what the Prime Minister has said. I don't think we have really to find new and alternative ways of democracy. I think we have to find alternative ways for how the existing ways should work for us. Otherwise, the ways are clear. And in terms of integration and how this can be people-owned, for example, the person raising the question talked about the infrastructure. But how are if we develop our infrastructure and even connected infrastructure and so on, how is this network of infrastructure going to serve us well when we still have a problem of allowing our people to move freely across our regions? So we have to think about, there are really things that exist that are there and we know they need to be tackled. But we just don't do that. So we don't have to look for an alternative for this, but to just make this work. So you develop infrastructure, you put a railway, you connect roads, you have all kinds of networks, telecommunications and everything, but you don't allow people to move freely, even using this infrastructure or working using this infrastructure. So I think we will have to deal with these obstacles that are still in the way in terms of connecting people of our regions or sub-regions or our continent. I think this is the missing link in my view.
Thank you. Way in the back there.
Thank you very much. My question is simple. If we take developmental state as an effective nationalist state, simple definition, if you take that way, is there a threat to such kind of state? What are the external threats and even internal threats to such kind of state? If you take developmental state as an effective and a nationalist state, so is there a threat to such kind of state, and what are the threats, external and internal? Thank you.
Thank you. Vice President?
I hear President Kagame says I haven't responded, so I should take this one too. I think that my sense of the discussion is that there's no standard prescription of what a democratic state should be. That various countries, given the social conditions, can create a system that works for them. And that the Western concept of human rights that is based on the individual can really divert us in a state where we don't have governmental structures, infrastructure, and so on, requires something slightly more than a focus on individual rights, just as a starting point. So how do we respond to the needs of a society when the external threat can divert you, as Prime Minister was saying, from one individual who does a misprocurement for a school and therefore denies 10,000 school kids in a village a possibility of going to school, deny their human rights, but the press will focus on the denial of rights for that single individual who may not have been taken to court, habeas corpus, and that is what we focus on, and ignore the large numbers of people whose human rights may have been denied by the actions of the single individual. And I think that that is the context in which I see that we must focus on the larger issue rather than the sensational. And unfortunately, quite a number in a number of countries, there's a focus on this sensationalism, partly because of the anonymity that new social media allows for this kind of thing. So I don't know if I've responded to the specific question you are asking about the threats, the internal threats. Internal threat, for me, is more of an undermining of the system that allows for us to respond to the needs of the population. The external threat, in many parts, mainly for me, is the diversion of us from focusing on what is important to what is peripheral in this thing. So that's how I see it, and we need to address the issues in that way. Thank you.
Thank you. Prime Minister.
I think I agree with the question in such a way that the democratic developmental states are nationalists because their main preoccupation is to eradicate poverty from their own country and mobilize along this line the whole people and sections of society. In that sense, I agree that they are nationalists because their main mission is to eradicate poverty. But on the other hand, I also see that the main threat is poverty, not somebody from outside. That's the policy in Ethiopia, that we do not have the worst enemy than poverty, that we have to fight by our tooth and nail. And therefore, we believe that the threat is inside, not outside. The threat is poverty within you that makes you vulnerable for any external, aggression. So the democratic developmental states has to focus properly on internal issues that becomes, a grave threat for them than somebody which comes from outside. Of course, as a nation, you have to deal with those kind of things, but they are not the main threat.
Thank you. Yes, here? Yes.
Thank you, Jendai. And we really appreciate the Excellency's input on this important topic. I just want to pose one simple question, which I hope to get clarity from the Excellencies. In terms of constructing this democratic developmental state. Oh, my name is Khabele Matlosa. I forgot to introduce myself. Khabele Matlosa. I'm Director for Political Affairs at the African Union Commission. We're based in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa. I'm sorry. One simple question, Excellencies. Concretely, what would you say are the feature characteristics of a democratic developmental state? So that we're able to say, if I'm sitting in the African Union, in Addis, I'm able to say, okay, taking these characteristics, I can characterize Rwanda as a developmental state, but I'm not able to do so for Kenya or any other country. Just point us. Because I think from the last question and the response from the Vice President and the Prime Minister, one characteristic comes out, nationalistic state. So are there others that we can share with us that could guide us to assess whether these countries are developmental states or not? Just some pointers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Prime Minister?
I think I have tried to enumerate those issues that Meles and his colleagues has delineated as the main nature and characteristics of developmental democratic states. The first one is obsession for eradicating poverty. And, full commitment within the ruling party as well as within the state and its bureaucracy that we have to eradicate poverty from this country within
a specified, very short period of time. That obsession, that commitment is prerequisite for any the democratic developmental state. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So it is the leadership that's the most important. If you find this kind of breeds of leadership in a certain state, then it is one of the characteristics that has to be seen as the basis. But that's not enough. For what are these things obsession comes? It is for accelerated, broad-based, inclusive growth. To me, maybe accelerated growth can be defined in many ways, but the minimum which has been said is 7% annual average economic growth is the minimum that has been put in place for eradicating poverty last 15 years. And maybe that can be one of the criteria that needs to see that there is an accelerated growth and development in that specific nation. But it should be inclusive and broad-based. And the second issue is there should be a broad consensus amongst the sections of society in that specific country on the development agenda. If you take Ethiopia as an example, we have one very important democratic developmental agenda we call Ethiopian Renaissance. That is shared by all Ethiopians, the majority of Ethiopians. There are also few which negate to this, but that is shared amongst all the Ethiopian sections of society. So everybody wants to see Ethiopian Renaissance in the near future, and gears towards every action and focus towards this Ethiopian Renaissance agenda. So there should be a shared, policy, programs, and projects in the country. And above all, for Africa, the most important thing is we have to stamp out rent-seeking and wasteful patronage networks within the government and the ruling parties. If that's not the case, I think obviously democratic development state cannot thrive. So that is the main disease that has to be stamped out. And if not, and you cannot have a democratic development state. On one hand, the rent-seeking political economy will lead to a zero-sum game democratic process where parties want to, take over by all means. You cannot have a mature democracy where there is, political economy which is pervasive and overwhelmingly rent-seeking. So that's the main characteristics of the democratic developmental state. And finally, it should be democratic. So I think these are some of the characteristics which can be mentioned.
Thank you. Very clear. Vice President, did you want to add anything?
Not just to add. I think that there's one overriding objective is as the Prime Minister has said, the long-term economic growth, accelerated, broad-based, and so on. But it requires that a number of conditions must be met. And the conditions that are met, you have stated it, first of all, it must be nationalistic. It must be in defense of its own people. And as I said earlier, it must be autonomous. You must be able to ward off influences that seek to divert us. And the special interests, as we've all said, the special interests that seek rent, that create corruption influences and so on, must be able to ward off those off. And there must be consensus so that it can survive individuals and governments. It must create consensus among the social partners, among business, among trade unions, among various strata of society, in order for it to survive people. And so that's how I see it.
Thank you. President Kagame? No? Okay, thank you. Other questions? Yes, right here.
Thank you. My name is Femi Mimiko. currently affiliated at the National Institute of Policy and Strategic Studies, Nigeria. I have just two quick questions. Number one, I think Your Excellencies are right on point, talking about the faulty basis of neoliberal orthodoxy and the need for the African states to be strong, to be developmental, and to be focused. My take is that when the African state is in the hands of visionary leaders without any need to patronize, visionary leaders like the leaders we have here, and they keep the state focused, they keep the state determined and nationalistic. For me, it's a question of time we will turn the bend and the African situation will find a turnaround. We'll defeat poverty, we'll defeat disease and all of that. But my concern, in the event that the African state falls into the hands of those who are not as visionary, I think that is the context in which suggestions have been made that indeed the African state could be very predatory and therefore require the people therefore require the protection, some form of protection against the African state. My question is, what do you recommend as the options for the African people in the event that the African state, in their own space, is not focused on development and not as visionary and as progressive as the governments that you represent? The second quick question, again, derives from the comments that have been made here. And I'm quite enthused with the efforts at grassroots mobilization for development, which is the basis of consensus. But now we cannot also deny the need for elite consensus. If we have the grassroots-based consensus and there's no consensus amongst the ruling elite, we have problems. And I'd like to know in specific terms, Your Excellencies, what your governments are doing to ensure you have some form of consensus amongst the elites, both in and outside of power. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I'll start with President Kagame.
Let me attempt to say it this way. So there is an answer in that very question. Because if you are saying when you have good leaders, then the state is not necessarily or is not predatory. It mainly happens when you have bad leaders. And therefore there is a need to protect the people from the state. So let me now ask it this way. Do bad leaders a monopoly of the African continent? So do you find only bad leaders or leaders who lack vision only on the African continent? Now, if the answer is no, that you can find them elsewhere, so what happens in that place elsewhere, and then they don't get the name predatory? So, therefore, we have to develop a situation where, and this is going to happen on the basis of the struggles that we go through almost every day, societies. And I don't think the struggles are just to happen in one place and they can't happen in another. I think the aspirations and the struggles that go on for those aspirations take place anywhere in this world. There are always people trying to improve their well-being, their standards of living, and making sure that, and then they do it through these structures as well as the continued evolving of leaders that lead different societies. So we can avoid bad leaders through these very struggles, because how does a bad leader exists, is there, and runs over everything else in one state or in one country forever. I think there must be pushing back. There must be people who push back, who resist that, and make sure that countries get leaders they deserve at one point or another. And I think that is the basis of this struggle. So predatory state shouldn't really be a name given to African bad situations. Maybe it should be a name given to all bad situations wherever they are. So I'm only therefore trying to say this is not a name tag for the Africans only. It should be wherever this happens, and it can happen anywhere else. Now, the consensus of the elites and the grassroots, I think we should have consensus cutting across as well. I don't think we should make an attempt to have a consensus, the grassroots consensus, and the elite consensus coming together. We should find a bridge, and I think that is going to be a better situation where we have a bridge joining the consensus of the elites as well as the consensus of the grassroots, because they exist in really one political space that has therefore been defined as the country or the state or the nation or both. So, and there are sufficient structures that allow this to happen. You have different institutions that are given rise to by this consensus at the grassroots level. If you have people coming to elect their leaders and so on and so forth, and the leaders at that grassroots level emerge, they have emerged, so to speak, to this extent as a consensus derived from the grassroots. And the elite that have their role to play in the debates that play out, they come to a certain consensus. And the beauty about consensus is that you have reached a level where there is agreement that you go forward. Still within the consensus, it doesn't mean that everybody has agreed to everything or sees everything the same way as the other, but it has come to a level where they have determined that they should go forward for the common good, even if there may still be differences which get addressed along the way. So I think, therefore, it is healthier to have a consensus at these two levels as well as the bridge joining the two. Yes.
Thank you. Prime Minister?
I think the first issue, this project of constructing a democratic developmental state is creating a new, paradigm, and you need to have leadership. Without proper leadership in place, I think this project cannot be successful. But we are lucky to have an extraordinary leadership like we have got from Comrade Melles. But it doesn't mean that all African countries get this kind of extraordinary leadership, which you don't get in a history, once or after many centuries. But the thing is, you have to have committed leaders that can emulate best practices elsewhere and implement them to proceed forward. I think this is possible in Africa. That's what we say. It's possible to have this kind of leadership, and but we have to recognize that it is necessary to have these strong leaders that pursue the characteristics of the democratic developmental states. As far as consensus creation is concerned, at the initial stage, it is not easy to get consensus from the intelligentsia, from the educated class, because the dominant ideology globally now is a neoliberal ideology. And every one of us are educated in the schools. Every economist has learned on the books of those, texts. So that is the ideology we have been brainwashed. But we have to see how that this new paradigm works from experience elsewhere and emulate it and come out. But the example in Ethiopia is Madame Azeb has presented the paper which Prime Minister Meles has presented to the Economic Association of Ethiopia. That was the time when we wanted to challenge our conventional economists on the ideas of the new beginning, democratic developmental state. But there has been a great consensus after that, conference that many has come to understand and started even research on those topics. So we have to engage with associations, professional associations, in different forms in order to bring consensus through time. But it's not an easy task that has to be taken care.
Thank you. Vice President?
Well, implicit in that question is a suggestion that I reject, that the African leaders have not learned. The African leaders are not learning. Because the Arab Spring, if I know, took place in Africa, in North Africa. And leaders learn from what happens in other places, and so do not allow the creation of those conditions that will create those in their countries. I think that you have to give credit to that. Because unlike previously when you expected the elite to lead mass mobilization, now the mobilization is led by the masses themselves, because education has progressed substantially in the last 20 years in Africa, and the ICT allows people to get information about what is happening in other places. And so if the masses then can mobilize themselves against policies that do not address their concerns, the leaders also learn from that and are able then to adopt measures that address the concerns of the people. So I think that it's been a good way in which both of us, or the leaders, learn from the concerns of the people, and the people can also mobilize themselves in defense of the things that need to be done for them.
Thank you. I'm going to take two more questions. Geraldine. No. You're coming next. Go.
Thank you. Geraldine Fraser Muleketi, African Development Bank. Excellencies, this morning, very clearly as Africans, we are taking this discussion forward about the African developmental state. And an issue that's come up here this morning, and I recall having had the rare privilege of hearing Prime Minister Zenawi talk about the need for policy space of Africans and African leaders in particular. Now, as we look at this particular discussion, the question of leadership is clearly beyond doubt. And we've heard a reference about the need to look at within the nation state and power within the nation state to take a democratic developmental state forward. However, I think we also want to argue and need to argue, and this was alluded to through the presentations, that there's a need for a diffusion of power, not only in a national environment, but also internationally. There's been some reference to this morning. What must we do as Africans to claim this policy space internationally as well? Because it's not as though we will be given the space to develop this democratic developmental state within an environment where there's not global pressures, push and pull. So that's the first. Secondly, are we as Africans ensuring that our foreign policy practitioners and negotiators are bold enough to take on the global arena to really push what is required for the African developmental state. And I think one would just make a reference to one area, climate change. This was also an area that we know much debate has been on. And then the last one, a simple question. What is the role of the youth and women in building the developmental state? Thanks.
Thank you. I'll start with Vice President Amisa Arthur.
If I understand the two questions, basically asking about how we claim the policy space because we'll not be giving the space. And secondly, about foreign policy options, basically, that are open to us. Let me take the question of the leadership and the policy space. I think that is what I alluded to at the beginning, that we need to find a mechanism to create the space for us. A couple of weeks ago, we were in the new Suez Canal, in which the people of Egypt themselves financed this extraordinary development without any foreign participation in terms of the funding. It was people themselves did it, and I know that this has also happened in Ethiopia and a few other places in Africa, that we have determined that some of the critical infrastructure needs to be done, and that the only way to do it is to mobilize financial resources from within our countries in order to do it. And that provides space for us to do the things that are priority for us, the things that give us an opportunity to raise growth levels and development in our countries. And a lot of that is going to happen. That experience, that lesson from the countries that are able to do it, means that now we no longer need development finance institutions to provide loans, sovereign guaranteed loans, for us to be able to do those important infrastructure interventions that are needed. And that is an aspect of the space that I was talking about. We will continue to learn from other African countries in ways in which they've been able to achieve this, and that those lessons are being learned and will be able to progress further. Now, in terms of the foreign policy practitioners and how they are going ahead, how they are doing in terms of the international negotiations and so on, that is a little more problematic for me, because we have relied essentially on the intellectual capacity of the African Development Bank, of the African, the ECA, the Economic Commission for Africa, to provide some of the countries with that analytical capacity on the basis of which they can proceed to define a national priority in order to do that. We may be lucky in terms of the capacity that we have for doing this analysis. But as I said earlier, it cannot be done on the basis of the nation state. The states are way too small to affect the international system. And therefore, we need to come together to speak with one voice. And that has not happened as much as we would expect, because that will provide us with the necessary conditions in which that can happen. And in West Africa, in the ECOWAS, we are trying to advance the work of integration. I know the SADC countries have done a bit more than us. The East African Community has done a lot more. But ECOWAS is also moving along in the same direction, and we need to combine our forces in order to be able to do that. So those are my thoughts on the two issues that you raised. As for the role of women, And children, I don't know how. Since I'm ready to learn from you on how to mobilize women in advancing the development state.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Prime Minister.
Your Excellency, I think that has long been understood by the African leaders. I commend the able leadership of President Thabo Mbeki, President Obasanjo, President Bouteflika, and also our Prime Minister Meles. They have understood long ago during the formation of the African Union to have a new partnership for African development, which is NEPAD, to go about how to have policy space when we deal with international community. So I think the thing is how to strengthen the process of NEPAD after these leaders and continue on with that vision for Africa. Similarly, in the fighting for climate change, you know that our leader has been the forefront, fighting, representing Africa to speak in one voice. That has been instrumental, and we need to pursue and push forward this agenda for the future. And as the Vice President said, the African Development Bank and the Economic Commission for Africa has been instrumental throughout this process. And that has been already understood. And we have Africa Agenda 2063. In that agenda, I think we have clearly put in place how we have to engage women and youth, which are our future for Africa. And I think we have well understood this. And the thing is how to implement those things as to the spirit of the papers we have written.
Thank you. President Kagame?
Claiming the policy space is related, is closely related to even how we project our foreign policy as well, and those who represent our countries in those areas. When you talk about climate change and the way things play out, as we have seen, everyone is at the table to discuss climate change, and all you see is how that relates to policy of different countries and how they get affected and how that affects what we need to do to manage properly climate change. So I don't think we would be very well represented in that area, or we are well represented in as far as that policy space is also clear from Africa's standpoint. So I think they are very closely related. But claiming policy space, again, comes from a number of things that have already been mentioned and points raised by the panelists. How do we really feel that we are fully representing ourselves, and Africa stops being that place where experiments are being carried out, lessons are being taught, but we never graduate from that. So I think it's up to us. And as you rightly said, I think nobody's going to hand it to us until we claim it, until we say this is good for us and we know it is good for the partnership that needs to exist between us and other parts of the world. And we want to be participants. We want to be properly represented where we actually represent ourselves. We cannot afford to go on for too long with this situation where Africa is just one part of the world that keeps being referred to, and everybody else who wants to do good, even the ones who want to do bad, they come to Africa. So we are a recipient of what is good and what is bad at the same time, and we never, we remain at the receiving end and are not raising ourselves to the level where we fully and properly participate. So it's really related to this policy space that we have to claim, and it is we to do that. It's not anybody else going to do it for us. And for the women and the youth, I think we have to see it this way, that women and youth are part of us, are part of our society. And when you are talking about a developmental state, it is that process that involves every citizen, every one of us, and the youth and the women are involved, but we are also aware of some of the existing weaknesses in our societies, and how people have been either marginalized or less involved, and therefore we need to step up to the plate to make sure that women are part of this process as fully as anyone of us, and the youth definitely. I think most of these things are just common sense.
Thank you. I'm going to, one last question right here, and then we'll close for lunch. Please.
Madam Chair, thank you very much.
No, not you. Right here.
No, let him have the floor.
Okay, please. But then I'm giving it to you. Go ahead, please. Sir.
Go ahead, Minister.
Yes, go.
Sajay is the Minister from Uganda.
Because you had given me a chance last time, I was very amazed if you didn't say that I should be coming online now.
You have the floor, sir.
Madam Chair, Your Excellencies, my name is Amatia Kashaija. I'm the Minister of Finance, Planning and Economic Development of the Republic of Uganda. Sir, Mr. President Kagame, I have a message for you from your brother, His Excellency Yoweri Kaguta Museveni. It's in writing here, but if you allowed me, I could read it, since it's not a state secret, so that it is recorded in the minutes of this symposium. Do you allow me, sir, to read it?
How long is it?
Very short.
Right. 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 Maybe,
I have also a small contribution to make, sir.
Yeah, maybe
it goes as follows, Your Excellency. I have received your letter of invitation for the launch of the annual Symposium on African Development, which will be held in Kigali on 21st of August 2015. I thank you, the African Development Bank, and the Zenawi Foundation for providing a platform for debate and analysis of the issues import for African development. Hopefully, these debates will provide us with the ideas, proposals, and policy suggestions that our governments can adopt in the implementation of the planned development programs. While I would have been happy to attend the launch of this important symposium, I'm unable to do so due to earlier scheduled commitments. I have, however, delegated Honorable Matia Kashaija, who is speaking, Minister of Finance, Planning and Community, to represent me. I wish you a fruitful deliberations. Please accept, Your Excellencies, the assurances of my highest regards. Signed, Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, President of the Republic of Uganda. Dated.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, can I be allowed to deliver this to your aide?
Thank you. Yeah. Now I'm giving the floor to Simhoff.
Please.
Now, can I make my...
No, sir. No, sir. No, sir. You've made your intervention. Next panel.
Oh.
Zimhal, please.
Thank you. I wanted to ask two questions. One is regarding finance. We've talked a lot about sort of having policy independence and mobilizing resources from within. To that extent, I think examples that we could cite from the Rwandan, for example, the Agaciro Fund and the Great Renaissance Dam. I don't know if it's a fund, but we're raising money for it together. On the other hand, both countries have also very recently debuted on the sovereign debt markets. And to some degree, if you're, I mean, I understand that you would have to be able to not pay the money that you, to pay the money back. But doesn't that cut on I'm sorry, I'm not articulating myself very well, but doesn't that to some degree, lessen your policy independence? And what was the rationale? Why this time? I addressed this question to both President Kagame and Prime Minister Haile Mariam. What was the rationale behind joining the international bond markets? The other question I have, it's something I'd like to pick up from what the gentleman from IGAD said. I think it's something around Medlis's thinking on the developmental state that hasn't really been mentioned, which I think he was trying to mention. He, I think, asserts that development is not a process of capital accumulation, but a process of accumulating technological capabilities. To what degree is that conceptualization of development visible within in the way we craft policy in Ethiopia, and to what extent has that played a role in policy making in general, or is that something that's thought about at all? Because we've talked about a lot of other aspects, but I think it was an assertion of his that in order to become a middle-income country, we need to be able to copy technology, and in order to become a high-income country, we need to be able to innovate. And that's something that I didn't hear being discussed. So I was just wondering if that's open to all of your excellencies.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samal. I think as far as the foreign debt is concerned, we have been getting and borrowing money from not only the international capital market, but bilateral organizations and countries like China, India. And we have been using this money for our infrastructure development, which is much more needed to see that the infrastructure deficit is accommodated. The thing is, there is no difference whether you get debt from China or from the capital market, wherever. The thing is, you have to understand that your debt sustainability ratio is in such a way that it is low risk. And if you go beyond that low risk, you are susceptible. That's where the policy rent comes. So we have to be very careful in looking into that, whether you are able to pay back the loan in such a way that you will not be susceptible to the pressure that's coming because you have failed to pay this debt. That's the most important issue, and we have checked this correctly. And I think the history shows that many developing countries use foreign savings to pursue their development in helping them for using the money that they borrow for infrastructure deficit completion. And we do also this from World Bank, ADB, and from other concessional loans. But when it comes to commercial loans, I think carefully scrutiny is necessary, as you said, not to compromise your policies, around this area. When it comes to technology accumulation, you are right. I think the most important stage that you need to have technology accumulation At the first stage, you have to have, technology implementation and use capacity rather than technology innovation, as you said. So we have to build how to use already existing technology globally. And through that course, you start to learn and try to modify the technology to suit your own conditions. And as you know, we have already assigned the Metal and Engineering Corporation for this technology transfer and technology adaptation, again, technology usage, and go beyond modifications. And if possible, there are technology innovation as well. So I think it's a ladder that you have to follow in doing so. We are in the right track doing this process and helping the technological capability accumulation.
Thank you. President?
Yes. I'll be very brief. The Prime Minister has almost said everything. I'll only add our debating on bond markets is in fact compatible with our intention of wanting to be independent. And here I want to assert that markets provide more of this independence than if you went for money elsewhere. So it's an issue of the markets and how these markets serve you. And as the Prime Minister said, you go to the markets, the capital markets, knowing your limitations, and therefore you have to operate within those limitations. But in as far as that is taken care of, then there is the kind of independence that we are able to attain other than other sources that may be highly politicized. With politics, there is very little independence, if you will, even if you are getting the money that you may be looking for. And for the second part of the question, for me, I think one is more important maybe than the other, but the two are equally important, are also important. And for me, it's either technological innovations or advancements, but on the side of capital also, well, accumulating it. If you want to accumulate capital, you must be doing that for a reason, because accumulating capital, if you are doing it with the reason of that enabling you to achieve other essential things that you want to do for development, then I think both of them are important, and they should be pursued, even if one may be more important than the other.
Thank you. Vice President?
Just a few quick words to complement what has been said. We also have, are in the sovereign bond market. Not only that, we've also opened up domestic bond for foreign investors. And in both instances, you are attracting resources from outside, and the requirement is that you behave in a way that is rational, that then creates less policy independence for you. But the question that we face is whether the provision of the resources that allow us to provide for some infrastructure is not ultimately better for us in terms of becoming less dependent on the global financial system. And that determination is made that we start not from a pure state of not having any relationship at all with the international finance system. We do have, and we are at the point where we have to decide whether any additional borrowing will be more beneficial in paying off some more expensive earlier borrowing or not. And so that becomes a rational decision for the policymaker. It is clear that that borrowing from the international financial system then limits the kind of things that you can do. It then looks regularly at economic performance, and the marketplace then judges you whether you're doing well or not. And that then creates the condition that we've all been describing earlier today, that association then limits your freedom, your degrees of freedom in the things that you have to do. But that decision has to be taken at each point, and we took that decision knowing that it has some advantages to us at this point. So that's it. In terms of technology and accumulation, there's been very interesting developments in West Africa where the young people are now developing software applications that address our needs. And we're encouraging that and hope that this would become even a greater trend in the future, in which they address specific concerns of our system and how that can be done. So yes, capital technology application, technology accumulation is very important from where we are going, and we are seeking to encourage it the more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This has been a most enriching discussion. We've learned what the democratic developmental state is in terms of its characteristics, both descriptively and prescriptively. We've talked about the need for greater work on how regional integration is incorporated into the concept of the democratic developmental state, about the need to forge social consensus, to create autonomy from capture by special interests nationally, as well as from chauvinistic orthodoxy externally. I believe that the leaders here have also told us how they've concretely worked in this area, that it's a continuous process of engagement with their own societies and reflection on how best to adjust as they move forward. So I think they've really set the foundation for a really important new paradigm shift for Africa that builds on the legacy of Prime Minister Meles Zenawi. Please join me in thanking the Excellencies this morning.
Thank you very much to Your Excellency, the Vice President of Ghana, Your Excellency, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, and Your Excellency, the President of Rwanda. Please also, ladies and gentlemen, the warmest applause for Jendai Fraser and the insights she provided. Okay, I can see people are shifty, a little bit unsettled. It is lunchtime. I am, though, the person standing between you and your lunch, and I apologize. Just two quick things that we need to do before we break for lunch. We heard a lot about the democratic developmental state. I'd like to just get a few remarks, very briefly, from Dr. Kaberuka.
Thank you. Thank you. I think our leaders have said everything, and I think they have done very well. But I have two comments I would like to leave with you, emanating from the symposium we had in Addis last year. The first thing we were told was, okay, so what is new in what Meles said? You'll hear this very often, people wanting to minimize the importance of what we're discussing. You'll find it out there in the writings. I want to say categorically that we think what Meles put on the table is fundamentally new. It was not the state of the 1960s, 1970s. It is a state which the leaders here have been describing. So I want you to go out and defend this paradigm without being defensive about the past. Second, the late Prime Minister's daughter, I think she's here, she challenged me and said, how did my father overcome his earlier Marxist leanings to become what he did? And the answer is very simple, is that Meles Zenawi, if he was here today, he would not want us to consecrate him as a saint. That is the last thing he would want us to do. He put ideas on the table for us to pursue further, and I think the leaders have done very well So that in earlier years, he had a way of looking at development, and he moved along is exactly what we should be doing as well and in the future. And we should not be defensive about it. Last point, though, what Prime Minister Haile Mariam mentioned. It can't be right that a country exports 1.4 million barrels of oil per day and half of its people live in poverty. That is not the kind of state we can defend under this paradigm. So we should be prepared to point out the kind of states we don't accept as falling under this paradigm. It cannot be that we would say, well, if the state is in charge, it is doing the right things. There are places where we absolutely have to say to ourselves, this is not right, and this is not a developmental state, and that's the rent-seeking you are mentioning. I think what you have said, for me and the bank as co-sponsor of this meeting, we feel very satisfied, and we want to thank you very much for what you have said today.
All right, thank you for those thoughts, Dr. Kabaruka. And just do remember, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to continue the conversation. The leaders have simply given us food for thought to stimulate further discussion later on. May I defer now to our host, the President of Rwanda, and ask you for closing thoughts, something we can just reflect on before lunch.
I think you have given us that, and it was a lot of food. You said a lot of food for thought, and I think we have our plate full. Now we are going to think about it.
Okay.
Thank you.
I like